This is Alec.
And this is Jack.
Welcome to another episode of Smith and Scholar. Smith and Scholar is a multimedia project dedicated to promoting and encouraging young men to pursue and live the good life. All right, well, we have finished discussing the four cardinal virtues.
Yes, we have. But the good news is there are some other virtues we can talk about too.
There are a lot of virtues we can talk about. However, we are only going to talk about this one, and then we're going to get into some more practical topics moving forward. I mean, there are bits and pieces of virtues that we're going to touch upon moving forward, and the idea too was to lay the groundwork so that we can move forward with the understanding of what the cardinal virtues are, because basically everything stems from them. And because this is a relational, because virtues are not lived in isolation and most people don't live in isolation, we also thought it'd be worthwhile to talk about some, one virtue in particular that is very much about relationships and relating to others. And what is that virtue?
That virtue would be charity.
Also known as?
Love.
What is love?
Got to do with it. Got to do
Baby,
with
don't
it.
hurt me.
Sorry, I got nothing.
Well, love is ubiquitous. It is heard in many songs. In fact, when we said the phrase, what is love, we both thought of two different songs. And I'm sure 93% of songs from the 60s were about love or have the word love in it.
It's probably accurate.
There are rom-coms out there which deal about the topic of love. So that's media, movies, and music. But then, again, it's about relationships. So love is something you've experienced from the time you were born, hopefully until the time that you die, with your parents at birth, and then with your loved ones, whether it's children, spouse, around the time of your death. So it is a long-lasting virtue, and it's not just a feeling, which we'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's a relationship, it's a virtue that you can develop, and it's important because again, it's how we relate to others. We're relational, we interact with other people, and it's just, I think it's needed to live life. So when you think about love in English, you just think of the word love, right?
Yeah, right.
you can say I like something or I love something.
Mm-hmm.
If you like something, you're like, it's good. If you love something, you might think it's great. And I'm thinking in terms of things.
Right.
If you like pizza, you're like, yeah, I like pizza. But if you love pizza, then, oh man, no, I want to eat pizza like at least once a week.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. And then, there's like a level of intensity to loving something, and then also loving someone.
Yeah, which is not the same thing as loving pizza.
Right, no, not at all.
And I hope it's not the same thing for people.
I hope not.
Because if it is, then there are some relational problems that are going on. So I think it's kind of interesting that in the English language, we do have the same word that you can use for multiple things. I love pizza. I love sports. I love my friend. I love my wife. I love my baby. I love my parents. And you use the same word, but all those are very different relationships. So we're hoping that today we can explain a little bit more about what is love, and in the classical sense of love, looking at love from the understanding of some of the philosophers, namely Greek philosophers. I guess it was Plato who described these. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So we'll dive into these four different domains of love. So, Jack, you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the first one is kind of like the most broad type or understanding of love, and that in the Greek is called storge. And storge is essentially what can be considered familial or communal love. So it's that bond, that relationship, and the feeling that comes out of that relationship between members of a family, or even more broadly, members of a community, a close community. It's not like it would be hard to say that you should maybe have a sense of care and charity for, your neighbor who lives 3 blocks down, but you don't necessarily know them, so you don't have that developed relationship. So that's why it's familial. But even though it's, in these, I guess you could say, like a familial context or close knit community context, it's a desire and a feeling, I shouldn't say a desire and a feeling. We're talking about virtue, so it's an action. So so living out storge is more. It proceeds more from a sense of duty than for any deep seated reasons that you might have. Maybe with the exception being the love that is between parent and child, brother and sister. Certainly there are duties there, or between like your grandparent and grandchild. There are certainly duties there, but there's also a little bit more there. But yes, that's the first one, storge, and this one I think is one that can be a little more difficult to recognize as a form of charity, as a form of love, mostly because when we like going back to the modern notions of love that we were talking about earlier, it's kind of forgotten, right? Which is sad, because we live in a society that's actually very individualistic, atomistic, and so there's just not this sense of storge anymore, which I think is too bad. Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting because, again, coming from a Catholic background, many philosophers and thinkers in the Catholic Church who've dealt with the topic of love, a lot of them actually don't include storge when they're looking at love, and so I think that's interesting for one respect. And I can't pull up any certain citations, but I know from things that I've read, it's always about the following three, which we'll talk about, and usually not about storge. So I think the first time I heard storge was actually sometime in college. Like I didn't even hear about it in high school, even though, because I was just telling Jack before this, I read this book by Peter Kreeft, and I thought it was called The Four Loves, but I think that's a C.S. Lewis book. So whichever book I read by Peter Kreeft, I think maybe it was Virtuous Love. If he talked about storge, it was very briefly, because I remember the other three from there. And maybe it's because the other three have more development behind them, more understanding, and I definitely was able to find more resources and read more about them in preparation for this podcast. But yes, storge I think is still an important element, and it's not about ordering the loves necessarily. I mean, I think we'll see one might be better than the others, but it's still a broad sense of love, duty, and so maybe it might be a little more shallow because it's not deep seated, but it is this sense of duty of like, what do I have to you? So it actually reminds me of justice. So you need storge, I think, to live out justice, or vice versa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially because justice is an ordering of relationships, and when we're talking about storges, you're saying it's all super relational, and not from like you said, deep seated relationships. It's more these exist because that's how we structure society or whatever, and so there are certain duties that correspond with those. And like we were talking about, usually when we're talking, going back to justice being about right, talking about duty, there's usually corresponding right, and therefore there's always going to be something that is owed to another. And so you could actually argue that charity is one of the, living with charity towards your neighbor is actually something that is owed to them, and therefore it's just to live out storge. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that, but I think that's a good insight.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've talked about storge. I think it's pretty well understood at this point, at least for me. But I read more about it. So hopefully you get the point of it being this communal love, which is not as deep seated, and you can see it on a broader scale. So the next one, and I actually had some trouble, and again, like I said, the way I ordered these, I did want to talk about storge first, just because it's kind of, again, not the deepest. The next one we're going to talk about is eros, and I think a lot of people know what eros is when they hear it, or eros, however you pronounce it, E-R-O-S. And because the words that come to mind that are derivatives of eros are erotic, which usually invokes images of sex, and carnal love.
Yeah, and so, like you just mentioned, it's very much like physical in nature. but again, it's built on relationship. So I guess you can understand it as seeking love from another, primarily, as we understand it, as our culture typically portrays it as physical. And as you said, it's typically associated with sex and passion and desire. And as I think we can see in our culture, it's often the most maybe it's idolized, and then it's also idealized. So like when we talk about love, and we'll get into the other two forms after this, but people often forget the other two, and eros is really all we focus on, and it's thought to be the ideal form of love, and we'll dispel that a little bit. We think that's incomplete. That's not the whole picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah.
So I think too, again, when you think of eros, when you think of erotic, you think it might be a little bit dirty or something, but I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think a lot of philosophers or thinkers, I don't want to generalize, but I remember one of the books I read where it kind of did paint eros as like a lesser form of love. And I don't necessarily think that. It's just a different expression or act of love. And it's not always associated with the physical, with the sexual, with the carnal desires. It can also be associated with something beyond that. So again, you can think of it in the form of sex between a man and a woman. But so a man and a woman can have an erotic love that is actualized through the act of sex. But a man and a woman can also have erotic love for each other that is not actualized through physical act, but more mental, emotional form. And that can be conversation, enjoying time with each other, something to that degree. Now, on a side note, I do think that those kind of relationships might ultimately end in some sort of physical manifestation just due to the nature of relationships between men and women. But that's, maybe something for another time. And when we look at the relationship and erotic love between a man and a woman that doesn't involve carnal desires, I guess it's usually called platonic friendship or platonic love. So that's one way to look at it. And then the other way, again, not in the view of it being carnal, but it can also be this kind of love for ideas and thoughts. So it sounds kind of weird, but when I was reading about it too, because again, my whole notion of erotic love was physical, kind of like, don't talk about that, but it's more than that.
Right. No, yeah, and it's kind of this, I think you kind of see this in maybe some like more old-fashioned portrayals of, like love and passion. It's like a driving force, right? It's that feeling in your gut that compels you to do something, right? Whether that's, like an old tale about, a man doing something virtuous to save a woman, right? Like he puffs up his chest and that sort of thing. But it also can compel you to like be, like you said, pursue ideas and thoughts and action, which is I think a cool way of thinking about it. And again, a more complete way of thinking about it. And again, it shows that eros is not a lesser love, but it's different, right? It has all these facets to it and important facets, and it's not just like that physical aspect that we see in our culture all the time. And it's not, it doesn't have to just be that.
Yeah, and so in this scope, we can see that it's not lesser. It's not just this base desires, although it is a motivating force, as Jack mentioned, poofing the chest out. But it's a different actualization, as we'll see in future loves. And so this is a family-friendly podcast. So maybe, we're trying not to be explicit here. So it's just keep that in mind.
You can figure it out.
Yeah. All right, so moving on from there, we'll move to the third form of love, which is philia. And so I think in the English language, it's a very common term. We have a city, Philadelphia. When you say, I'm a Anglophile, I love English stuff, it's the same root word. And it's philosophy is the love of wisdom. So we can see in our English language that this philia, this form of love, is used quite often in our language. And the way that it works is that it's a mutual love. So while Storge is kind of this communal duty bound love, this is a love between two persons that is reciprocated. And it can also be thought of as a spiritual type of love, so it transcends more than just the body. It transcends more than just maybe shared thoughts. Excuse me, but it's something that connects two people together.
Yeah, and it's not just friends, but it can also be, this is a type of love that you have with your family, and the love for others. And speaking from personal experience, Alec and I think, have been very fortunate to have really, really good friends in our lives, particularly from our high school, like the group of guys that we essentially grew up with in high school. And I could say that for a lot of them, I think this is a type of love that we share with them. And so I think that in a way, I almost think that this love is often, other than Storge, this love might be the most overlooked of the loves, because we don't really consider it to be that important. I think we take it for granted in a way. And so, yeah, I think it's something that it's not just your friends, but this is the type of love that you have to an extent with your family members. It goes beyond the Storge. And I think as we get into the next kind of love, we'll see how, I think philia in a ways can be the base for, the next form of love, and we can get into that a little bit more. But I know, philia, and I don't have a really good way to describe it. Alec, maybe you can get into it, but there's something, I guess, like conditional about philia.
Yeah. So, I guess the way I think about it is, you don't just start out on base level saying, or reciprocating love to someone. And I guess using the word reciprocating means that somebody has to do something for you in order to reciprocate it. And that's maybe what philia starts as, because if you do a good act towards someone else, then you return a good act, and then you're building that relationship, and in the process, you are building love, between each other. It sounds kind of weird, but I guess that's the point. And you're growing in love for each other as well. So it's conditional in that you need to maintain it. There's a certain level of maintenance. And so at some point in time, it could, you could lose this form of love if you continue to do good acts for another. If you continue to love one person, but they fail to reciprocate that love, then maybe you no longer feel love for that person, and you no longer have this philia. You're no longer loving a person. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And just, I guess, thinking about some of my more serious friendships, I think that's definitely what it looks like. And we'll stop here talking about philia, because we're going to do a whole episode on friendship. And actually, I think it's Aristotle who breaks down philia, friendship, into 3 different types, and we're going to talk about those, I think, next time, actually.
Yes.
And so we'll get into a little more detail on that. But yeah, I think we'll have some good conversations on that for sure.
Yeah, so while philia is conditional because there's a give and take, the next form of love, agape, is unconditional. And from a purely humanistic standpoint, I think it can make sense in some circumstances, especially because the Greek philosophers, not all of them were deists or believed in a god, or they had polytheistic views. I think it can still make sense. Now, it sounds weird, like, to give fully unconditional love towards another, because if they're doing nothing for you, then why would you love them? But let's take, for example, a baby who can really do nothing for you, out of their will.
Right.
However, you still love that baby with all your being, with all your soul. Like, you will do anything for them. And I think that's a very powerful image of agape for parents, for children, because you know what that is.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it had to be a couple of years ago, but I saw an article that was talking about love in the context of American culture, and it specifically talking about agape. And I think that it comes from this understanding that agape love is what's called kenotic or kenotic. I'm not necessarily sure how to pronounce it. It's Kenotic, and it means emptying. It's self-emptying. So agape is a self-emptying. It's like you said, it's sacrificial. And I think the parent-child image is great. I think agape comes from the Greek philosophers, but this idea of agape love is really, really touched upon in Christianity. And in fact, it's central to the story of Christianity. I think the parent-child image is great, right? In Christianity, the story of Christianity is a loving God who creates man. Man falls and is basically helpless, for all intents and purposes. Is like the child, right? Can't really do anything for God. God created us to, love him and worship him and to know him. But for all intents and purposes, man continues to fail at that. And so what does God do? He sends his son, created in his image, fully God, fully man, to sacrifice himself, a total outpouring of himself, a total self-emptying in order to save his creation. So I think, that's in the Christian context, that's really, really agape is hit upon quite hard.
Yeah, and I think it's clear to see the unconditional love because, again, if humanity keeps on failing to live up to, their full potential, which is all the time, which is me, which is Jack. I don't want to speak for you, but
I unfortunately I do in fact fail to live up to my full potential.
So, and then you have a God, which we come from the stance that God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful. And several other, perfections, degrees of perfection. So, and you have imperfect beings who can't live up to that, who don't live up to that. Well, then, of course, an imperfect being would eventually say, well, I'm done with this in this relationship. I no longer love you. But again, from our stance, the Christian God, our God, does have agape for us. He does love us unconditionally. So this has been studied throughout the past 2 millennia because of the example that God gives us in agape of self-giving love.
Yeah, and I think we're something that comes to mind here. We talked about fortitude last week, and how fortitude is specifically this willingness to endure, to self-sacrifice. And so I think there's really, when we're talking about charity, it kind of makes sense to follow from fortitude because in order to, at least to the greatest extent, agape, but in all the forms of love that we're talking about, there's this level of self-sacrifice involved. So you need fortitude. You need to be willing to do that, right? And so, I think that's what I just wanted to add there about that is that fortitude is maybe it's, again, going back to this understanding of machismo or manliness, like fortitude. It's kind of countercultural, right? Like, we don't often talk about love when we talk about what a man is, but it's very integral to who a man is. He has to be able to endure to love.
Yeah. Because also, if you don't love, then you don't have relationship with others, even on a basic aspect. Well, I guess your relationship can be disordered if it's not love, or not based in love. So, and again, agape, we talked a lot about Christian examples, but again, the philosophers who came up with this were not Christian. But I think we see a perfection of agape through God. So now that we've covered these 4 different types of love, storge, eros, philia, and agape, of which philia we will cover more on those different types of friendship next podcast, next episode. We can kind of see what it is. It's this giving. It's and again, most perfectly exemplified in agape, this self-giving for another. So then, if we think about what love is not, I think a lot of people might think of hate, but hate is still an act of which you are outpouring something to another person. You're giving another person something, and it's not love. But that's not the opposite of love. The opposite of love is actually indifference. And that sounds, again, it may sound a little bit jarring because, you think love and hate, those 2 words, those 2 actions are put together closely, very closely. To pull in a comical example, Tom Haverford in Parks and Rec says something along the lines of, I get the girls to hate me because it's closer to love.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, like hate is passion, right? And whenever I hear that, I go, peace is a lie. Yeah, have you heard the Sith code? Peace is a lie. Peace is a lie. there's only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. That bad code to live by, but but no, I think, and hate, tying it into love. If we love something so intensely, we should actually hate things that are counter to it, right? And that's itself is a form of love. So we're talking about the good life here. That's what we're focused on. You should hate the things that are counter to the good life. That might be a hard thing to wrap your head around, particularly because we live in a world where hate is considered such a horrible thing that no one should ever hate, when in fact, I think people secretly hate things all the time, or they mask their hate in other ways. But I think we can rightfully hate stuff. So yeah, I think hate is not the opposite of love. In fact, they can mesh, and you can, get the girls to hate you because it's closer to love, right? And like you said, I think in fact, it's the opposite of love is indifference. It's not even acknowledging the presence of another person. It's not acknowledging the relationship you have between them, whether they're someone who's close to you because they're family or someone in your community. And so in that way, I think that's really when you find the opposite of love.
Yeah, and I think we can see in depictions in media. This was the first thing that came to my mind when I thought of indifference is the neglected child, because it's a sad topic, but if your parents love you, then you're happy. If your parents hate you, at least you're getting attention from them. And again, for people who have a disordered relationship of hate, or their parents hate their child, then the child will still act up or do something in order to receive attention from the parents, whether it's disordered or not. However, if the child is pining for attention and still doesn't get it, they see that indifference, and it's a total lack of acknowledging someone's presence, of realizing that another person is there. That's one of the most inhuman things you can do, because you're treating somebody as if they're not even human by not recognizing them, by not giving them the time of day. So I think it's really important to take note of, because I think many times in our day, in our life, we can take this kind of indifference on, whether it's towards our friends who, maybe don't respond to you, and then you think, oh man, they don't like me, so I'm going to, ignore them, or, you're out for a walk and somebody waves at you and you don't acknowledge your presence. I mean, that's a lower stake example, but still, not acknowledging another person's presence can be damaging, harmful. And it's also not just damaging or harmful to them, but to yourself as well, because you are, if you're not growing in virtue, well, then you might be growing in vice. So by not exercising love, by not practicing love, even in the small things, then that might be an instance. So indifference is the opposite of love, not hate. Now that, again, that doesn't mean that you should go around hating and saying, well, it's closer to love than indifference.
Right.
But I think at this point you understand the levels of how this works. Again, just hate, just anger, not just as a just form of anger,
right,
and hate can be healthy and good.
Yeah, so now that we've gone over each of these 4 forms of love, we kind of thought of a few questions to discuss, and we'd like to share those with you because it might help you brainstorm a little bit, and we'll talk about our answers. So, we kind of, when we're talking about the virtues, when we talked about the cardinal virtues, we talked about developing and learning them. So, why don't we start with, how can we develop these loves? How do we habituate charity?
Yeah, so I think, again, with agape, we see the perfection of it, which is total self-giving. And so, it's going to be pretty hard to start out a relationship totally giving yourself to another. So it takes smaller sacrifices to give to another. And, when you're developing a friendship, I think it's pretty clear to see how to develop it, because you try and find common interests. And like, we're getting into friendship now because it's a part of love. So I'll try not to talk too much about it. But as you're getting to know somebody, you will try and forego some of your interests in order to appease some of the things that they want to do, or bring yourself to try and enjoy, or at least experience some of the things that they do. So just that little form of sacrifice in yourself, I think, can help you develop love.
Yeah, I think that's true. And like you said, agape is the most hard to come by, I guess, when we're talking about habituating it. But you can really see how, like you said, like the little sacrifices. Again, I just want to tie it back to fortitude because I think it makes the most sense. I think if you learn to practice fortitude well, you might actually learn to practice charity well too. And so that's maybe that is a way in which we can habituate charity better, is by also habituating fortitude better. So because I think they are very much intrinsically linked.
Yeah. So we also had this question, which we kind of answered at the beginning, is love a feeling?
And not really, no, because are there components of it that are feelings? Yes, certainly, because like we're talking about relational, your relationships and how you live relationally and that sort of thing, and there are definitely feelings involved when you're talking about that. But again, we're talking about virtue, and if we're talking about virtue, we're talking about will and habit, and that requires action, and so it goes beyond just feelings. It goes beyond, if you think about it, charity. What charity is we could tie all the virtues in right now. Again, like I guess charity is prudentially discerning a relationship, combined with justice, recognizing what is owed to the person that whatever this relationship is. Fortitude is the willingness to endure for it and to strive for it, and temperance temperance, you can think about it like as in like what's like the required level of what the action I'm doing, and it's different. Like, and this is actually maybe a good way of thinking about the degradation. And I don't mean degradation like bad. I mean or gradations. That's what I mean. Gradations between like eros and philia and agape, because they require different things, right? Like, like we were talking about. And so, in that way, that it's all a will, right? You're like, you have to do these things. And so in that way, it's an action.
Yeah. And I think also that some highly rationalists can think of love beyond just an action, because we have brain chemistry, we have emotions, we are a whole being, we're a human being, so we have body and soul. But that also includes, again, you can experience feelings of love by releases of chemicals in your brain.
That was the first thing that came to mind, which is wild and beyond my pay grade, and I will probably never understand how that happens. But when I've read articles and stuff about it, it's like, holy smokes, that's cool, right?
Yeah, and I am not a neurochemist or a neuropsychologist, so I don't know all these different things. I do know some levels of psychology, but again, that's also beyond my pay grade. Mine's more on the cognitive experience. So how fast do you react to things? Like somebody telling you, I love you.
Oh my goodness.
So it's not a feeling, it's an act, it's a virtue. And again, we can see that it requires action. Self-giving is not just a feeling. You can't just feel, oh, I'm feeling generous today. You have to act upon it in order to show love, to give love to another. So then the next part, and I think we kind of touched upon this as we discussed this, and maybe the listeners have discerned to some degree, are some of these loves greater or lesser than another?
Knowing that this question was coming and thinking about it a little bit, I'm not necessarily. So I will say that I don't think anyone is more important than the other, if that makes sense, right? Like, in order to properly live charity, you need to be able to properly live out storge, eros, philia, and agape. But like I used the term gradations earlier, each of them requires something different, and particularly agape requires something so much greater than the other ones. And so I think to that extent, it is greater because it calls for so much more than, so like starting with storge, right? Like we kind of, left it at, it's like fulfilling a sense of duty, right? That's pretty, it's just there, right? Duty's there. You have to do it. And then eros is kind of like this, driving, most of the time we think of it as physical, but also it's like, it's this drive. And then you have philia, which is this mutual love. And you, like you said, you have to develop it, and you can easily lose it if you don't continue to strengthen those bonds of friendship. And then you have agape. And, like I said, it's that kenotic self-emptying. And that is a crazy step to take. Like, I think there are little ways in which, in my life I have lived out agape, but I mean, I've never I mean, ultimately, like, what is agape? It's putting your life on the line for the other, whether that actually be your physical life or your reputation or something like that. And I don't think I've ever had to do that. And so, like, that's really like a higher call of duty is, I guess, I said duty, but it's not really duty, right? But like, it's a higher call and a harder call to fulfill.
Yeah, well, I don't think I can add any more to that. So another thing I was thinking about is, do we have to love everybody? And so when we think of it in just the English language of love, do I have to love everybody? You think, well, not really, because if I love everybody, then I'm giving them hugs and treating them well and nicely and going above and beyond, because that's what love is in a more Anglo, I guess, English understanding of love. So I think beyond that, now that we've kind of covered these 4 different types of love, storge might be the most basic sense in which we can love everybody, because it's community, it's familial. And when you're thinking about the human race, well, we're one big community, we're one big family. Sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's true. We're all on this globe together, and we all have a duty to help one another, whether it's something we can actualize in the physical present, or if it's something that we're going to do later on in our lives. We still have a duty to one another to be good for everybody. So I think that's one way in which we can love everybody. And it might look different in different circumstances as well. Moving beyond the global sense of humanity, loving our friends, philia, loving everybody. So,
yeah, I think there's different aspects of it, right? Like you were saying, like there's different ways in which this is actualized, and I think we could talk about this more at some other point. But I think there's like an aspect of like being willing to forgive. I think forgiveness is a form of love and humility. And so I think in a way that's an easy way in which we can actualize, this idea of, are we called to love everyone? Are we supposed to love everyone? I think that's an easy way to actualize it, is can you be forgiving? Because that doesn't call upon you to, like, that's a way in which we should be relational with everyone, is a willingness to forgive. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but that's just something I think about, because it's just not possible, right, to love everyone, because we don't interact with everyone on a daily basis. We don't have actual relationships with everyone, but because, and I say this because I'm Catholic, and I have certain priors, right, as do you, about the understanding of the human person and what is owed to each person. But I think this is something that everyone can relate to on a certain scale, and I think should recognize that we are in fact called to act in charity towards all people.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. Again, going beyond just some of the initial thoughts of what it means to love everybody. So, are there any other ideas you want to delve into or look into, or?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, I think we had a really good conversation today about charity, and I hope all our listeners appreciated it and learned a thing or two.
Yeah, and I hope that this serves as a nice stepping stone moving forward, because we're going to get into friendship, we're going to get into other certain types of relationships, and how to move forward in those. And this understanding of charity, I think, is integral to those, so that we can live charity and with friends, family, everybody around us.
Definitely.
All right. Sounds good. What is love? Well, I think we can answer that question now.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Smith and Scholar. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Also, follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with everything we are doing and thinking.
Finally, feel free to give us feedback and ask questions across the different platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Smith and Scholar.